So as we flow out of Ashley's, here's the other thing I'm thinking. We also, our methodology is, we're kind of captive of the technical advances in software. So, you know, one reason I think we didn't all move into doing some of these other kinds of, you know, what was Proc Gen Mod in SAS, I don't know about Stata, but in SAS, I think Proc Gen Mod is only maybe since the late 90s or so. You know what I'm saying? So the whole idea of being able to do general linear models and being able to pick your distribution and pick your transformation of the outcome variable is fairly new on a relative scale. It's fairly new, right? I mean, you couldn't do it in 1985 with the software that was available unless you were writing your own, you know, matrix algebra, you know, whatever. It wasn't automated. And so we're going to talk about now multinomial modeling, that cumulative and generalized logit, and at least in SAS, although I should look now, you know, because I'm so used to doing it this way, unless the newest version has something different than I know about, it's logistic modeling. So you're going to get odds ratios. I don't think I can do, again, unless and that would be interesting to know whether I can do what Ashley's suggesting, run a logistic model and get probabilities out of it. That would be really interesting with a multinomial outcome. So both in Proc Logistic, and you can also run in Proc Gen Mod, I also believe you cannot do generalized logit. You can do cumulative logit. I hope I'm saying this right. I think that's the last I know. But it's a logistic model. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So we are going to talk about odds ratios again for a while. So I would love it if there was an easier, whether in whatever software, whether that there would be a way to do cumulative log modeling or whatever, you know. But right now it's logistic. So we talked about this a little before, and now we'll just go into more detail, and I have some examples, some better examples, I think. I've given some examples where we might think about more than a dichotomous categorical variable that might be of interest to us. So whether it's different causes of death, whether it's BMI categories, you get the point. And actually we're going to look at, one of my examples is looking at prenatal care as the outcome variable. So actually you'll see I've modeled the Kovalchuk index, the APNCU, as the outcome variable. It's a multi-category variable. What predicts, you know, what are factors, demographic and other, that get women into having either inadequate care or adequate plus care, et cetera. So that's the idea with this. And so we're talking about not continuous variables for the cumulative logit model, but truly ordinal variables. So the order matters, but there's a top and a bottom. So it isn't truly continuous in the sense of it can go from negative infinity to positive infinity. There's some, you know, thresholds. And this is the same idea. You know, if you, like a Likert scale, something, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that, there's a top and a bottom. You model that as a continuous variable, and you could predict somebody scoring a 6 or scoring a 7 because you're counting it as a continuous variable. So you don't really want to do that. And then there's this idea to be really honest with you, here's a Likert scale. These are some very fine points that, to be honest, every time I look at them, the idea here is you're asserting, if it's ordinal, that you really do have, on a Likert scale, that the difference between being circling 1 and circling 2 versus circling 2 is basically the same as the difference between circling 2 and circling 3 on an odds ratio scale, right? That there's, again, a consistency because of the ordering. And so that you don't have to look at different, separately at different categories. Yeah? Yeah. Can you do with multinomial? You can get back to probabilities? Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. That's good to know. Did you hear, I don't know if you were here this morning, Ashley, do you know if Stata has an option to do cumulative or generalized where some of the variables might be considered as nominal and where some variables will yield one summary odds ratio for an outcome and some variables will yield separate, distinct? It's called partial something, and I don't know whether Stata does it. I don't think SAS does.
I don't know.
Okay.
But I love Stata, so let's
Let's pretend that Stata does it. Okay. So here we have just some more examples that you might argue. So how about, this might be interesting too, a summative scale of, let's say, the Pram's stress variables, or we can come up with lots of examples actually in maternal and child health where we might think that there was an ordinal, that the variable had truly ordered categories. We talked a little bit about the proportional odds assumption, so I've just restated it here, and I think I've put my picture in again, where you're again asserting that where you make category boundaries, where you make cut points, is it between category 1 and 2, is it between 2 and 3, that you're going to get a similar association, and therefore you can summarize and end up with one single summary odds ratio in this case. And so we looked at one example of proportional, of the score test, and we'll look at some more of that. And just to be aware that the hypothesis is stated that the odds ratio between the association between a risk factor and an ordinal outcome are constant, regardless of how the category boundaries are drawn. And if that assumption holds, then the association between an independent variable, this is just more formally stated than what I've been saying to you anyway. And so we can look at the score test, and the way that null is stated, the non-significant result, so p-value, a high p-value, a big p-value, means that the null hypothesis isn't going to be rejected. And so that you can make the assumption of proportional odds. And if you get a significant result, it means that the proportional odds assumption may not hold. And then just to say that a statistician at UIC, and I think I've read elsewhere, the score test is very sensitive. So often you will get low p-value, you'll get significant results, and maybe you could really just use one odds, or you could run cumulative Logit and not have to move to generalized. So it's the test isn't perfect. So here is I think you saw this one other time. Again, it's thinking about, for the cumulative Logit model, you're always looking at your whole sample and you're just shifting where you've drawn category boundaries and how you're combining and recombining those categories. So we've got the denominator changing each time. Category 1 versus all others, category 1 and 2 combined versus the rest of the categories. So both the numerator and the denominator are shifting. And that's the picture which we saw this morning, just to remind you how thinking about it in terms of getting to 2x2 tables and calculating separate odds ratios for each way that you're recombining the columns of data. And so we're going to have k-1 intercept terms, but we're only going to have one slope parameter, one beta coefficient for a given variable in the model. And then I wanted to point out to you that I can actually kind of mimic the results of a cumulative logit model. If you, so this is the way, this is just purely for illustration. Thinking about running separate models where you've recoded the variables to be like have a variable that's category 1 versus, you know, new dichotomous variables. That's what you're seeing here. I've created a categorical variable where I have 3 of them now, ordvar1, ordvar2, and ordvar3. The first time through, it's category 1 versus everybody else. The second time through, it's categories 1 and 2 versus, except for missing values, anybody else. The third time through, it's the top 3 categories versus everybody else, because that's what, behind the scenes, if I run a cumulative logit model, that's what's going on. And so then I, you know, again, purely for illustration, I can run 3 different models. Now each has a binary, a regular old, this is binary logistic regression, outcome variable. All the observations are in each of these models, so they're not stratum specific in the sense where, you know, you've only got one group in one model and another group in another model. Everybody's in all of these. We've just, whether it's ordvar 1, 2, or 3, where I drew the category cut points in the outcome variable changed. And what do I expect to see then? If the proportional odds assumption holds, I should get approximately the same odds ratios across these 3 models. Doesn't matter where I draw the cut points. So some reasons why maybe we get significant results if the score test indicating that the proportional odds assumption doesn't hold. Maybe we really do have a nominal variable, not an ordinal one. Maybe we've misspecified how we are defining our ordinal variable. This would be, so, you know, on a Likert scale, by definition, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What if I am making what I think is, for example, income? Like I think I'm making an ordinal variable, but I've started out thinking of incorrect threshold values. Because what you're thinking of is that those are actually true threshold values that are on, not a continuum, but, you know, on the ordinal scale that mean something. And so here's about the score test being sensitive. Now we go back to thinking about the outcome categories being nominal for generalized logit, having a common reference group. So it's more like dummy variables on the left-hand side of the equation where I'm defining each category versus a reference group. So that looks like that, and so then that means here the denominator never changes, unlike cumulative logit. The numerator is changing, but I have these mutually exclusive, like dummy variables, contrasts between one category versus the reference group, between the next category versus the reference group. And you saw this before this morning as well. Just shows the difference in how this operates, and that again, we don't assume proportional odds here. And truthfully, just like dummy variables on the other side, even if you think you might have an ordinal variable, there's no harm in running it as generalized logit. You still might see something and report something in a slightly different way, same as on the other side of the equation, sometimes assumption-free. I don't want to make an assumption about an ordinal variable on either side of the equation. Maybe I want to empirically look at what category-specific contrasts yield. It does, when you've got these, in generalized Logit, it's pretty easy in cumulative, but in generalized Logit, so if you have a 3 or a 4 category outcome variable, then writing the sentences that interpret then what the beta coefficients mean gets a little hard. So, and you can even see they're quite, this isn't that great either. You know, they're sort of tongue twisters. And that is what makes, for me anyway, generalized, I really like generalized Logit a lot, but it is, you really have to work on communicating the results. It's not something that seems, that's intuitive to people. So I've tried to say, compared to those with factor A, without factor A, those with factor A have whatever the beta coefficient, you know, sometimes the odds of having the outcome, but in a particular category. We looked at an example this morning, like of having a very low birth weight baby. And then you got to say it again for having, what are the odds for having a moderately low birth weight baby? So we'll work through some examples and think about that. Then again for illustration, just so you actually see what this means, I've tried to show a stratified approach for mimicking what generalized Logit done. And here you can see I'm using where statements in SAS to just say category 4 is the reference group. So I'm modeling category 1 versus category 4. People who have values 2 and 3 aren't even in that model. Samples, it's not the whole sample. It's just those, comparing those in category 1 to category 4, then to category 2 to category 4, then to category 3 to category 4. And you wouldn't do it this way, but it helped me to really sort of understand what was going on in those models behind the scene. And this is a way you could check. This isn't exactly right, I want to say, what I wrote here. The ORs here are going to differ, even if proportional odds held, because the way the contrasts are being, you know, it's like, say, the highest risk versus the lowest risk, the medium risk against the lowest risk. So of course those odds ratios are going to differ. You'd want to see them, though, increasing or decreasing in some sort of monotonic-like fashion. Then you would wonder if you could maybe try cumulative Logit and see if you could, if the proportional odds assumption holds. So I couldn't help doing this because it's my work. I like it. So here's a real example. Oh, I mentioned this morning. This was when the CDC asked us to look at maternal and child health functioning in the states. And it's a longer story, which I won't go into, but our team, we got a lot of materials from states. We did telephone interviews with every single one of the states and the District of Columbia, and we asked the states to send us material. We had tons of data about more at a capacity level of what was going on with MCH epidemiology. And our team sort of qualitatively, we had a system, it was systematic, but it was qualitative, came up with an outcome variable with 3 categories. Was a state above average in MCH functioning, average or below average? And actually, well, that's another story, forget it. Anyway, and then, so we had a 3-category outcome. We had really small sample size, right? We had a sample size of 51, 50 states and DC. So we actually did run generalized Logit, but you can imagine that, you know, so then you have separate beta coefficients for each of the categories you're looking at, and you can see we had quite a few variables. So this is a cumulative Logit model because we looked at odds ratios and, you know, there was some departure from proportionality, but it wasn't that great. So we felt we could go on to, so I thought I would share with you the kinds of variables, and we got, again, with really small sample size, look at the p-values here. Not bad for a sample size of 51, right? So we had things like organizational position, which was an ordinal variable saying kind of where was there actually an MCH epi unit, or was MCH epi in a bigger epi unit. It was about the structure and where the MCH epis sat. And then we talked about who sets the agenda for MCH epi. Is it just the Title V director? Is it the epis? Is it some combination? Does it include external stakeholders? And so we actually had two different variables there. I kind of like those results a lot. And so what is the interpretation here? Staff with doctoral training? Did you have assignees, fellows, or interns in addition to that? What about data sharing? This was, by the way, the interviews were in, I think it was either 2004 or 2005. So about 10 years ago that we did this. So, things have changed, clearly. But, so what's the interpretation here with a 3-category outcome variable, and this is a cumulative Logit model, and these are odds ratios. So why don't we let's take doctorally trained staff with an odds ratio of 2.5. So only one odds ratio, it's cumulative Logit. So what does that odds ratio of 2.5 mean? Anybody want to try? This was just numbers of staff.
So
yeah.
Is it for every additional staff person
with doctoral training?
Is associated with a 2.5 times the odds of being in one of the higher two?
Well, the next, yeah, right, in a higher category of functioning. And that it would be the same, because we're assuming proportional odds here, that 2.5 holds whether you look at above average versus combining average and below average, or if you combined above average to below average. That on average, the more doctoral staff you have, the higher the odds that that state is going to be functioning at a higher level for MCH epidemiology.
So does that 2.5 stay the same for going from 0 key staff with doctoral training to 1 key staff, and from 1 to 2, 2 to 3? Or
Well, so remember, it's where you, so if you think about, and not many states had more, it was like a count variable between 0 and, I can't remember, but something relative, 5 or something. So remember, it's having 5 versus 4, 3, 2, 1, 0 combined, 5 and 4 combined versus 3, 2, 1, 0 combined, et cetera, that the assumption is that no matter where you made that for each of those, when you change those category boundaries, the association was approximately 2.5. Anyway, I like sharing these results because I still like them. Anyway. Okay, so how about this? What I've done here is, and as Ashley said, these are examples. So, I was looking to get certain results that would be illustrative. So this isn't exactly the way, a real problem that I would do this way, at least this example. So this is the association of maternal risk and fetal infant death so this is just amongst preterm deliveries looking at death, okay? So what you can see is here's where I've got any kind of fetal and neonatal death combined and survival at least through the neonatal period. And then this is a 2x3 table where I've separated out fetal deaths from neonatal deaths and then survivors to make it a 3-category variable. And here's the result just of a crude model with just the dichotomous outcome, so death versus survivor, any kind of death versus survivor, and it's maternal risk, yes or no. We've got a really low point estimate here, okay, and it's confidence interval. And now let's look at what you get when you run cumulative Logit with the 3-category variable. So you can see the N's that we have, the fetal deaths, the neonatal deaths, and the survivors. And remember, this is all preterm delivery. So it's not everybody, it's not all, and here's the score test. And it's highly significant, so that the interpretation there is that the proportional odds assumption doesn't hold. So of course, in order to get the score test, you have to run the cumulative Logit model. So you might as well look at the output, right? You've seen maybe this isn't appropriate, you should run generalized Logit, but you've run the model. So here are the results of that probably incorrect cumulative Logit model. And I just did, again, some plugging and chugging here. But for you to look at this, and actually the dichotomous variable looked about the same, right? We had 1.05, some really low odds ratio when we just did the dichotomous variable. So let's go on and then do the generalized Logit since the proportional odds assumption didn't hold. And now what do we see? What's happening here? So this is fetal death, the association of maternal medical risk and fetal death versus being a survivor. And this one is the association between maternal medical risk and being a neonatal, having all preterm birth, having a baby die in the first 28 days of life versus surviving. And so what, again, it's an example to get to this result. So this is what we got from the cumulative Logit model, the one summary odds ratio. And now we see we actually have two slopes on either side of the null. So it looks like, this is not significant, but we're on the protective side. I mean, fetal death is, maternal medical risk is not protective against fetal death, but we have this funky odds ratio here, confidence intervals cross the null. And here we have actually a statistically significant result for just looking at neonatal death. So, maybe here what this means is forget generalized Logit. Let's just run a binary model and not include fetal deaths in the same model. But even that tells you something in terms of maybe I've thought about this problem not right, and I'm going to bias towards the null if I include fetal deaths and neonatal deaths in the same model, those kinds of issues. This was just to illustrate that sometimes you're really going to get contradictory results between cumulative and generalized Logit. So I wanted to, so this is a fairly, at least it's got more variables in it. So we've got birth weight categories. This was back to very low birth weight, moderately low birth weight, term birth weight, with smoking, late no prenatal care, maternal medical risk, maternal age, a parity risk variable, and one multiplicative term in the model. And I'm asking it to run a generalized Logit model. And I've written some contrast statements, which you can do here too. And I really have to sit at my desk when I do this because now I've got multiple categories on the outcome side of the equation. So see, like, what do my labels mean? Well, we'll look at the output and see if we can figure out. This looks like smoking and maternal medical risk amongst women that had history of preterm birth, right? And so we've got smoking and medical risk, and then we've got the smoking by parity risk variable because we're looking at smoking as well. This one is smoking and risk just amongst premips, and then smoking and risk amongst low-risk multips, just to, And again, thinking through what's in the numerator and what's in the denominator to get these. Let's see what I came up with here. So first, we get type 3 effects again. So predicting this 3-category outcome variable that's being handled like dummy variables. And I have, see, look at this. Smoking is a dichotomous variable, but it's got 2 degrees of freedom because I now have, right? It's going to have 2 slope parameters because one is predicting very low birth weight, one's predicting moderately low birth weight. So even though it's dichotomous, and then I have this, 2 slopes for maternal risk, 2 slopes for mom age. Parity risk, I've got 4 slopes for because it's a set of dummy variables. And then the interaction term, and you can see what everything here is statistically significant. And here's what look at this. It can get pretty hairy because you've got all these intercept terms and you really have to think about what they mean. And then here's all these multiplicative terms in the model. And when you look at those, some significant, some not significant, maybe you're going to decide about collapsing levels, trying to simplify the model. I mean, keep in mind here, looking at constructs overall, I know there's a multiplicative term, but still, separate effects, joint effects, whatever. We got a statistical significance here. When I look at the individual beta coefficients, it gets really complicated, and I clearly want to simplify my model. And I'm just seeing what's going on here with mom age. So each one, as we go through this, mom age is not involved in a multiplicative term. So this is slope number 1 is again predicting the very low birth weight to normal birth weight contrast. Slope number 2 is predicting the moderately low birth weight to normal birth weight contrast. And so you can, kind of try and draw some conclusions there. But this is, of course, the complicated one. Wouldn't it be nice to just get rid of all that? But do we really think we can? I guess that's the question. So we've got these 2. The separate effects for some of these are significant. Whether there's interaction or not, I think maybe I would take out that interaction term out of the model. It's too complicated. And so I did some, with my estimate statements. So let's say, with history of preterm, smoking and medical risk, slope number 1, slope number 2, very low birth weight, moderately low birth weight. This one is amongst premips, pretty similar for very low birth weight and moderately low birth weight, actually pretty similar here too, which might say, do we need the 3 categories? Again, maybe we can go back to binary, or maybe we really need to respecify categories. And I know, let's take it out of the model. Okay, so this is now with, everybody here use the APNCU, the Kovalchuk index? Do you know what it is? And okay. So for this example, I've looked at, did you have a previous low birth weight infant or no history of low birth weight or premip? I combine them. That's a whole other discussion. It's just an example, okay? So to keep it easy so this is the predictor variable, right? This is the independent variable on the right-hand side of the equation when we get to modeling. And then we're looking at categories of the APNCU as the outcome variable. And I can even start looking at, if you look at the row percents, so you're just looking like within no prenatal care, here's the proportion, the prevalence differences. This is inadequate care. So remember, top row is the higher risk group, history of preterm, history of low birth weight, sorry. Intermediate care, not much difference. Adequate care, what's going on here? And then adequate plus. Does somebody want to talk to me about these categories of APNCU? So for example, it looks like women with a history they're multips, they've had at least one other low birth weight infant. There's more of them getting a higher proportion of them getting adequate plus care. There's a lower proportion of them getting adequate care. There's also higher proportions of them down at this end. What's going on here?
People with previous low birth weight are high risk birth.
Okay.
High risk, they probably go to get prenatal care at a higher utilization rate. So those are kind of more high risk births are in the adequate plus, and then no prenatal care. I mean, those ones are getting less. They're decreasing their risk of low birth weight possibly.
You have two populations. You have one they're both at very high risk, but one of them's not getting very good care, and the others are getting excellent care.
Right, and so Kotelchuk index always has this it's definitely a nominal variable. So there's a tendency, because of the way it's labeled, from none to inadequate to intermediate, you start out thinking it's ordinal, but of course it isn't ordinal because of what both of you are saying. The way women both seek care and the way women are sought for care by the system is very different if you have a previous history, you're a known high-risk woman. I mean, frankly, so this is totally appropriate, right? This is appropriate. What the heck is that? That's not appropriate. And then here, too, I feel like these are all multips. Now, I don't know whether they had prenatal care in their last pregnancy, but they are known to the system somewhere, unless they move to a different state or something. But, just assume for now they live in the same state. To me, this is real system failure down here, even the inadequate. This is a known high-risk woman. Why the heck isn't she being followed? You know what I mean? Where's the gap that after postpartum care, she fell out somewhere so that when she's pregnant again, she's not getting into prenatal care in a timely and or adequate, numbers of visits. So I think that's interesting right here. We haven't even done any modeling. I think this is an interesting look anyway, with prenatal care as the outcome variable. We are most often using prenatal care as the risk factor, right? Predicting, whatever, low birth weight, infant mortality, whatever. But here it is the outcome, categorical outcome variable. So here are the tables for the categories. And again, this is if we were going to do incorrectly, we know this is wrong, cumulative logit, because it's clearly, APNCU is clearly a set of nominal categories, but just to remind you of what this looks like. And then these are the correct kind of contrasts that we'll get for doing generalized logit modeling. So we've got no prenatal care. I've chosen adequate as the reference group, not adequate plus. So it's no versus adequate, inadequate versus adequate, intermediate versus adequate, and adequate plus versus adequate. Common reference group. By the way, I don't know if anybody, one of the first things I would actually do here to make it simpler, have you, even with prenatal care as a risk factor, what if you, at least this is what I've noticed with APNCU, there's not a whole heck of a lot of a difference between intermediate and adequate. If you model dummy variables on the right side of the equation, I rarely see a significant result. If adequate's the reference group, I am often combining intermediate, at least they got intermediate care, So I don't know if you all have seen that same result, but I certainly have. Yeah.
I just want to say, when I talked to Dr. Kovalchuk, he discouraged me to include intermediate with the adequate.
I know, I've talked to him about it too.
Yeah,
But but I disagree with him.
Okay.
You should know that Milt was on my dissertation committee, those many years ago. Milt and I yak about this all the time. Hey, in the original APNCU, by the way, who said this morning, there is not a separate category for no prenatal care. no prenatal care is lumped in with inadequate. And from the get-go, I've been separating out those no prenatal care people. So somebody mentioned that this morning. I don't remember who it was. But so, things are meant to be tweaked with, and go for it. Anyway, so just for the heck of it, even though we know it's wrong, here are the results from Cumulative, Logit, where you get 1 point estimate, which is basically at the null. So that wasn't two. You get all these intercept terms, but 1 slope, 1 beta coefficient for the effect of previous low birth weight. And then here are the generalized Logit results. So let's look down here. Again, always compared to adequate care, right? If you were a multiparous woman who had a history of previous delivering a low birth weight baby, what's your likelihood of getting into no prenatal care compared to adequate, inadequate compared to adequate, what do I have here? Intermediate compared to adequate, and then adequate plus. And it's the same pattern, obviously, that we saw in just looking at the tables, right? This is not a multivariable model. It's just got the one variable in it. I think that's interesting because it does talk about systems issues. Here you have a known group of high-risk women. Ideally, shouldn't they be the ones that are all getting good prenatal care? So that's a system failure to me. So I tried to put into words because it does get hard. And of course, this could be adjusting for lots of other variables if you ran a more complicated model. So women with a prior low birth weight delivery had more than 4 times the odds of receiving no or inadequate prenatal care rather than adequate care compared to women with no history of low birth weight delivery. Did I say preterm before? Low birth weight delivery. And then compared to women, so that's at one end of that, the set of APNCU categories. And then compared to women without a history of low birth weight delivery, however, these high-risk women also had more than twice the odds of appropriately receiving care beyond what is considered adequate for most women. So that was my attempt at articulating what those results said. And I think this top piece is really important. They're both important, but I think that top piece is really important. Just a summary of this. And just to remind you about the proportional odds assumption or no proportional odds assumption, 1 slope parameter more than k-1 slope parameters, both having k-1 intercept terms. Okay, and that it does get it admittedly gets the it's not that the interpretation is difficult, it's hard to communicate it, harder than a model with a simpler outcome variable. So just some ways to, and as I look at these issues for categorizing an outcome variable, they're also issues for categorizing, whether it's going to be on the right-hand or the left-hand side of the equation, same issues, right? There should be conceptual meaning driving how you turn a variable into a categorical variable, not total reliance on statistical tests, a lot of reliance on judgment and your understanding of the issue, and of course, sample size and power. We tend to be lucky in public health. If we're using like vital records, we've got a lot. But if we're using, PRAMS data, even though we weight it and all of that, but the actual sample size is pretty small, right? So we're going to do a quick, and I mean quick, discussion, and I would like to hear from you about this too, because everybody, Kristen and I go back and forth on this. Model building to me is an art, probably more than it is a science. And people do it different ways, and people have been trained in different ways depending on where you were and who you had for your instructors and all of that. And I think we all, and in my view, there is not just one valid way. So I'm just going to try and highlight the issues to think about, and ways to approach it. And I'd like to hear from you what your ways are. And then we'll go through this quite quickly, take a break, and then you guys will actually, with Kristen, interactively get to talk about model building in a real problem that we've got going for you. So, the first thing, of course, is, this is still about generalized Logit, because we are going to do model building in general. But for generalized Logit, we're talking about just making the right category cut points. And anyway, you heard all this already. Anyway, you heard all this already. I'm skipping these. You heard all that already. This actually, I'll just stop here for a minute. Because you could run those separate models, sort of stratum-specific models. And what's really nice, even though the results get kind of complicated from, because you've got multiple beta coefficients for a single variable and all of that, it's actually, if you can cope with it, kind of nice because it gives you one joint look at what's going on across the categories. And if you do it stratum specific, there's a tendency, this is true in even binary modeling, or even whatever. If you do stratum specific modeling, there's a tendency to want to build the best model within each stratum, which may mean you end up with different variables in each of those models. And that's not necessarily so good, because then, let's say smoking happens to be in both models, but you're not going to really be able to compare the relative prevalence of smoking in model 1 in one group to the relative prevalence in another group if the other variables in the model are different. So in some ways, it's better to do it this way as one model. Let there be some insignificant beta coefficients for certain variables predicting certain categories of the outcome variable, because then you can actually compare across those different contrasts. And this also actually is true, and it doesn't have to be a multinomial outcome. Just some caveats here about, again, thinking about category boundaries and the good thing about doing it as ordinal as opposed to continuous. Again, using a logistic model, we don't have to assume normal distribution or any of that stuff in a logistic model. And this, I think, is obvious, so I'm going to get through. Okay, now we're generally into modeling approaches. And I'm available to answer questions about multinomial modeling, too. This is the same stuff you've heard before, that do not dive right into modeling, even though we all, if we admit it, cheat on this sometimes. But honestly, you've got to do that preliminary work. And because you're not, just like we looked at the prenatal care just now, the row percents, to understand what was the sample size in those cells, and then, when you get to modeling, you sort of understand a little better what's going on in your data. Why is some confidence interval hugely wide in your data? Well, how many people are in that cell when you've put 8 variables in the model? And if you didn't look at univariate, bivariate, and some stratified analysis, how would you know where the small sample sizes are going to occur and what might be leading to huge confidence intervals? I've got rules in quotes here for a reason, because, of course, rules are meant to be broken. So it's like anything else. It does help if in advance you set down maybe, what's a better word than rules? Some guideposts, some guidelines for under what conditions you're going to leave a variable in the model or not. Under what conditions are you going to leave an interaction term in the model or not. It's not always purely on statistical significance. I will tell you right now, If I have some variable in and the p-value is 0.08 and I think it's conceptually important, I'm not taking it out of the model. I don't care whether it's meets some arbitrary idea of statistical significance. And the same thing with even multiplicative interaction, because if I've looked at what's going on in the stratum-specific data in tables first, if I have a p-value for a product term that's like 0.07, if I think those stratum-specific differences are meaningful, I'm leaving it in the model. So it helps, though, so you're not totally, rooting around to try and set some soft rules for how you're going to approach your model building process. And then because in our world, whether it's the PRAMS data or vitals or whatever, and you've got, I have 500 variables and so many observations, to lay out a conceptual framework and then think through the subset of variables you actually think are important. You're not going to start building models willy-nilly, trying every permutation and combination of 100 variables, right? You've got to have some rubric for how you're going to approach this. And one of the things I do like to do is sometimes run preliminary models within what I call domains. So like, okay, I have a series of SES variables. Which variables do I want to have move on to when I'm really getting into final modeling? And okay, I have a bunch of clinical variables. I'm not going to use all of them. First let me think through conceptually what they mean in terms of the issue I'm addressing, but also just look at them together, unadjusted for demographics and all that. Try and understand what's going on with them. And the same, these are just my categories. I mean, you could, depending on the problem, you might have different domains, but something like that. Of course, refer back to the literature, because you're not the first person probably to be addressing a particular issue. Maybe you're doing it in an innovative and novel way, which would be great, or maybe, which is also great, you're just trying to replicate for a county in your state or something like that. You want to know what the literature says, and you'll see what other authors have done in terms of building multivariable models. So of course you want to think about that too. You want to look at how correlated. This also happens at this stage because you got a bunch of clinical variables, maybe there's a lot of correlation amongst them. You don't want to put a whole bunch of highly correlated variables in the same model. You're going to get some biased results maybe. So you're going to have to think through what do those correlations mean and how do you want to handle them. Maybe you want to make some new variables. Maybe you want to combine some variables using composite, recode them into one variable like age and parity, which are correlated. We've talked about that before. Or maybe you think one is strong and is a stand-in for the others. So maybe you'll only include one of those variables, only include income but not education. Maybe not both, maybe yes. Maybe you'll make some SES index. Those are the issues you have to think through. Do you think it'll be more informative instead of analyzing your whole sample and having to look at lots of interaction terms and all that? Maybe for a particular purpose, maybe you're interested, maybe something has been raised in your state or your county, about a particular subgroup of people. Maybe it's simpler to then do a separate analysis for that group. You can always go back to the literature too and see what others have done with broader populations. Thinking about level of measurement. So this is on either side of the equation, right? How are we going to use dummy variables? If so, how many are we going to make? What's the coding for them? What's the choice of reference group? If we think it's ordinal, but how refined, or should we just use something as a continuous? We could use income as a fully continuous variable, right? If we really knew exact, not aggregated in $10,000 units or something like that. When is it appropriate to use continuous variables? And knowing that actually on the right-hand side of the equation, a continuous and even an ordinal variable, each beta coefficient, remember these are linear models. If you've got a significant beta coefficient and it's an ordinal or continuous variable, it's a test for trend, or dose response, or however you want to think about it. If you have year in the model, it truly is a test for a time trend, but any other continuous or close to continuous kind of variable, that test of that beta coefficient in a linear model is a test for linear trend or linear dose response. How are you going to handle, so we just confronted this, previous low birth weight infant. What do I do with primiparous women? In that little example, I combined them with other multiparous women, but who didn't have a history of prior history of low birth weight infant. Maybe that wasn't appropriate. How do I want to handle primiparous women who we don't, right? It's like the counterfactual. We don't know whether they could have had a previous low birth weight infant. They haven't had the opportunity to have it. So those kinds of variables, you have to think through how you want to handle them. Causal pathway issues. Does someone want to say to me what I mean by causal pathway issues? And what are the implications from Epi 101 or whatever?
So like what logic model you're working with?
But what is the problem if I put variables that are in a causal pathway in between some variable I'm interested in and an outcome variable? Well, it wouldn't be called if it's in the causal pathway, what particular kind of effect will it have? So really, you might even miss an association. If you're looking at a variable farther back on the causal chain and an outcome, and you have all sorts of this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, by the time you get to those so close to the outcome, you may not see a significant association with the one farther back on the causal chain. So really, if that's the variable you're interested in, you should not include, it's not like controlling for confounding, you should not include those other intervening variables in the model. And there's ways we can handle that, but it is another, as you say, it's another reason why thinking through a logic model or a conceptual framework is important, so that you don't all of a sudden look at a model and say, oh, well, that variable's not significant, and you haven't thought through what might be depressing its effect in the model. Combining variables, we've talked about that a little. I tend to like to do that because I tend to not want to get, if I have variables that are correlated, I don't want to give one of them up. So I think through how I could get the best of all worlds by maybe making some variable that is a composite of 2 or 3 other variables. Thinking about how complicated this is, interaction can get, and trying to decide how you're going to handle and how much interaction you're going to look at. Again, why stratified analysis is so important, so that before you move into modeling, at least at a single factor stratified, maybe stratifying by 2 factors, you can anticipate where you might see multiplicative interaction, and you'll have seen what's happening in each stratum. You'll see the sample size. You'll see what those prevalence estimates are in each stratum, and be able to be a little bit more efficient as you move into modeling. We've talked about the type 3 tests, which I think are very useful, and I think a lot of people just go straight to the parameter estimates page of the output. I think it's really worth it to look at the type 3 tests as well. So this is more about having product terms in the model, and then this is back to what I said before in the multinomial context. It is easier to run stratified models. It's one reason, rather than having those product terms and then having to use the slice command in SAS or contrast statements or something to calculate stratum-specific estimates. Why not run stratum-specific models? And you can certainly do that, and I definitely do that sometimes. It depends on how you're, ultimately how you want to report the data, and then to be aware of, you're not going to get a test, a formal test for interaction if you do it that way, so usually good to start out with product terms in the model, see if they're either statistically significant or close enough and you think it's meaningful, then choose to run stratum specific, and to be aware of building models that have the same set of variables in them across strata if you really want to compare across your 2 or 3 different models. There are all these automated, model selection routines in all the software, and at least the party line where I come from is, it's perfectly fine to kind of manually mimic these approaches, and a lot of people do that. It's not okay to throw variables in the model, let the automatic procedures run, and take that as your final model. That is truly copping out of our responsibility as analysts to control what's going on in that. The stepwise procedure does not have a conceptual framework for the problem that I'm studying. So that's our party line. You can compare across models, either nested models or models of the same size, to try and get a sense of best models. Again, it depends on the purpose that you're doing this for, the issue you're doing, and why do you want to compare this model to that model? Now, in terms of nested models, you can actually do all of that within, you can run one model and you can ask SAS to compare groups of here's a 5-variable model, here's a 7-variable model with the same 5 variables. You can ask for the joint impact of adding those 2 new variables. Was it worth it to add them to the model or not? You can do all that kind of thing now, much more automated than 10 years ago. And then I guess my soapbox about this, which is and you can please argue with me about this if you don't agree, but I feel like I'm a different kind of analyst, that even if the work, let's say even for the Title V needs assessment, if most of what I end up wanting to present in the needs assessment is univariate, bivariate, maybe 3 variables at a time kind of stuff, like not fancy, multivariable models, I feel like 2 things. One, the fact that I think in a multivariable way, and that empirically I run some multivariable analysis for me or my team or whatever, and we agonize over it, makes this simpler analysis at the end better than it would have been if I just did simple analysis and didn't think through multivariable issues. I'm sticking to that perspective. So because I think, I just know for myself. I think a different way because I understand some of the fancier techniques. So even if I'm not going to, that's not going to be what I present, to my audience, I think differently about data in generally because I know about those methods and can run them and look at them and interpret what's going on. And I'm just postulating that that's true for all of us. Maybe it's not, so I'd love to hear your opinion about that. And this is just more soapboxy kinds of things. I do, you can see I'm on my soapbox here, right? Challenges the epidemiologist to better articulate what questions are of interest. So that's my perspective and my point of view on this. And so I would encourage you, to see if you agree with me or not. We don't have to go through this now, we can end, but I've just given you might for yourself, so this is stressful life events, and then I've got maternal depression, some variables that we're interested in, and I've given you some ideas of different ways you might want to model or examine these issues, and take the time at some point to think it through, because we have lots of possibilities. We know about lots of different modeling methods and whatever. Do we want continuous, ordinal, what kind of outcome variable, et cetera? How do we want to categorize the data? So I am just sort of challenging you on your own to think about that. Maybe you want to run them every way, but which models would best answer which kinds of questions, those sorts of things. And then just one more thing. I knew we wouldn't have time for this. In your binders, I've given you a few little brain teasers of exercises, which you can throw out if you want. But if you want to challenge yourself, or you want to try them and then talk to me or Kristen or Ashley about what your answers were and whether you were doing it right or whatever, it's just something else for you to play with whenever, if you want to, and whenever you have the time to do it. So we get to break now, and then I guess we'll have 15 minutes, and then Kristen you'll get a lot of chance to talk and interact on a real problem. In real time, you're going to do some modeling with Kristen. So thank you for getting through all this intense but I think fun material, and take a break.